Initially, I'd staked out the April update to explore how Disney was working towards social engineering projects, and how one of those projects might be designed to encourage a certain type of social bond, sometimes called bridging bonds. If you looked at the various proposed and built Disney communities, they each seem arranged to encourage different types of social connections. I had imagined, for the April update, an engaging episode about how concepts of new urbanism also framed various concepts for Disney-built communities. But then March happened, and at the corporate level, the Walt Disney Company started to come unglued. Some in the company called the second week of March the worst week for Disney in decades. And they did say that, fully aware that 2 years ago, every single Disney park around the globe was closed due to COVID. Much of the present controversy circles around CEO Bob Chapek. By the end of this past month, The Hollywood Reporter posted an article speculating that Disney would remove Chapek by next February. And also, by the end of the month, Republicans in the Florida legislature announced that, after Chapek's comments, they held multiple meetings to explore the possibility of overturning the 1967 Reedy Creek Improvement Act, which allows Disney to act as its own government in building, among other things, roadways, unique attractions, themed areas, and resorts. I know that there's been a strong anti-Chapek sentiment among Disney Parks fans. Until mid-February, though, I would say that things were actually a little bit more mixed. In my opinion, there were some things that Chapek handled well, and some things he did not. But then in March, this situation got a whole lot worse. So today on the podcast, a detailed explanation as to how we arrived at this unique moment and what it means for the future of the Disney company. Usually on our updates, we have a few sections. Today, we have just one. It's big and chunky and complex, and it's taken me most of the week to put together. It's an involved story that's unfolded over years and looks at how company culture has changed between Bob Iger's 15-year run as CEO and the last 2 years with Chapek. So if you're ready, if you've got your earbuds in and are out for a long walk or a drive all the way to the other side of town, here we go. To fully understand the problems inside and outside of the company as they played out over the past month and a half, we need to spin back the clock a few years. We need to define who Bob Iger, the previous CEO, was in terms of a company leader, so we can better understand how his successor, Bob Chapek, changed multiple aspects of Disney company culture. Early in Iger's tenure as CEO, he bought Pixar for $7.4 billion, which unified Disney with some key Pixar characters and key talent associated with its brand. This established Iger's identity as a deal-maker and forecasted the direction he would move in later years. Iger's vision early on was to expand the breadth of Disney film and TV projects. He would later purchase Marvel Entertainment, which was then moving heavily into film, and Lucasfilm, largely for its Star Wars franchise. These three purchases might someday be viewed as the three most important acquisitions for the future of the Disney company. This new breadth was a key component in Iger's vision to launch Disney+, which featured not only traditional Disney entertainment, but also rich offerings from Star Wars and Marvel, which helped drive subscriptions. Iger was generally admired, or at least respected, by fans. He was good with soft issues, specifically those requiring communication and personal connection. One of his strengths was his ability to understand the needs of talent. On stage and before cameras, he was able to represent the company in a way that suggested he was emotionally engaged with its films and parks, and beyond the financials, understood the wonders that drew fans into the Disney experience. Early in 2020, he decided to retire from his role as CEO and become executive chairman, staying with the company through the end of 2021. His successor was Bob Chapek. Admittedly, Chapek became CEO during one of the most difficult periods in the company's history, likely beat out only by World War II. He became CEO on February 25, 2020, less than a month before every Disney park around the globe closed for COVID, less than a month before theaters closed, cruise ships closed, Adventures by Disney closed, and nearly every other thing around which the company had built its identity, minus TV, home video, and Disney+. No one was going to fault Chapek for poor financial performance in 2020, 2021, and probably not even in 2022. But then the entertainment world saw Chapek at the center of other controversies. As I mentioned earlier, his early months as CEO, I would say, were mixed. There were highlights. Like other Disney executives, Chapek took a substantial pay cut during the early months of the pandemic. He was able to open the Florida and Shanghai parks fairly early in the pandemic with more safety procedures in place than found at many non-Disney parks. There was social distancing, limited seating areas, substantial installation of plexiglass, and teams focused on ensuring that cast members and guests managed themselves in a way that kept others safe. Then there was the NBA bubble at Disney World, sort of an ingenious move. The NBA restarted its season at Disney World using otherwise empty hotels and sports facilities. And despite the pandemic, Chapek moved forward with some fairly large projects for the parks, such as a clone of Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway for California, the Journey of Water area at Epcot, and the Tron Coaster at the Magic Kingdom, all of which could have been delayed far more than they were. The first large problem, which was kept quiet as it happened, was a dissolution of Chapek's relationship with Bob Iger, who was staying on at the company as executive chairman for nearly the first 2 years of Chapek's initial 3-year contract as CEO. Behind the scenes, Chapek, at least according to multiple reports, was frustrated that Iger remained at Disney and was still viewed as the company's leader. The pandemic only made this situation worse. In the New York Times, 1 month into various COVID closures, Iger, who had agreed to forego his salary while the parks and theaters remained closed, expressed his desire to help the company move through this difficult period. Quote, "A crisis of this magnitude," Iger said, "and its impact on Disney would necessarily result in my actively helping Bob Chapek and the company contend with it, particularly since I ran the company for 15 years. Reportedly, Chapek viewed this as a slight, as though he might not be able to manage the crisis on his own. In the public's eye, Chapek felt he would be viewed as second in command or just one of the Bobs. Reportedly, he was furious over this interview, which might have been read as Iger reasserting control of the company. After the article was published, there was less collaboration between Iger's and Chapek's offices, a situation that lasted for months and also set up a later problem. Chapek sensed that he had been, in some way, publicly disrespected, may have contributed to him being elected to the board ahead of schedule as a way to minimize problems inside the executive suite. Just 3 days after that New York Times article was published, the one with Iger's quote, Disney offered a press release that said, quote, "Chapek has demonstrated leadership in the face of unprecedented challenges that were unimaginable when he became CEO just 7 weeks ago." With this, Chapek was quickly elected to the board of directors, a move that was likely intended as a very public vote of confidence in his abilities. The second large problem involved an internal reorganization of the Disney company. In October 2020, Chapek restructured its media and entertainment divisions and appointed Kareem Daniel as its new head. In previous years, Daniel had worked closely with Chapek, Chapek had even hired Daniel many years earlier as an intern while he was in an MBA program at Stanford, and after that, Daniel stayed with Chapek on projects for parks and products. In this new role, Daniel would oversee which content was released to theaters and which was released to the company's new streaming service with an eye toward growing Disney Plus toward profitability. At the time of Daniel's promotion, Chapek explained, quote, "Managing content creation, distinct from distribution, will allow us to be more effective and nimble in making the content consumers most want, delivered in the way they prefer to consume it." But in this, Chapek also removed significant authority and responsibility from longtime creative executives. Though Marvel, Pixar, and Lucasfilm would still make content, Chapek and Daniel would ultimately decide how that content was released. Daniel's office would also have the final profit and loss accountability. Reportedly, studio executives were upset that Chapek had moved in one of his own people to take over key aspects of their jobs. In essence, under Chapek, power over release strategies and budgets were consolidated more under business and financial executives and reduced for creative executives. This decision contributed to some in-house discontent and also set up a management scenario that contributed to later problems. The third large problem concerned the hybrid release strategy for Black Widow, which was released on July 9, 2021, a decision that was arranged through Kareem Daniels' office and supported by Chapek, though was not popular with Kevin Feige, who oversaw Marvel Studios. In short, Disney made the decision to release the film simultaneously in theaters and as a premiere access feature on Disney+. Though home viewers did pay $30 to access the film, the premium on-demand charge was likely less than families would have paid to view the film in a theater. This produced lower overall revenue for the film, which created a situation in which the film star, Scarlett Johansson, believed that she was owed additional payment as part of a revenue-sharing agreement because Disney in part was using the film to spike its subscription numbers on Disney+, a situation that only benefited the company, not her. At this point, the disagreement between Disney and Johansson seemed like a reasonable outcome as film distribution strategies changed due to the pandemic and would need to be negotiated and settled. But that's not what happened. Even though other studios, such as Warner Brothers, were negotiating new back-end agreements with talent over streaming revenue, Disney held firm that it had contractual authority to choose the release strategy and had no further obligation to Johansson. Avoiding this type of public disagreement between talent and the studio was something at which Iger and his team had excelled. But after that frosty reception that Iger had received from Chapek over the past year, due to the New York Times article, reportedly, Iger chose not to help Chapek resolve the problem with Johansson and instead let Chapek do it himself. From there, things went downhill quickly, with a dispute that played out in public space. On July 24th, Johansson filed a lawsuit which got a quick response from Disney. Quote, "There is no merit whatsoever to this filing," a representative at Disney said. "The lawsuit is especially sad and distressing in its callous disregard for the horrific and prolonged global effects of the COVID-19 pandemic." In industry circles, this response did not play out well. One trade quickly pointed out that in terms of the effects stemming from COVID, Disney had, quote, laid off 32,000 of its workers. Both sides then made statements which were picked up and commented on by the press. Screen Actors Guild president Gabrielle Carteris took Johansson's side. Quote, "Scarlett Johansson is shining a white-hot spotlight on the improper shifts in compensation that companies are attempting to slip by talent as distribution models change." For some, including Carteris, Johansson was becoming a symbol of a woman standing up to a corporate structure over issues of pay, which again cast Disney, and particularly Chapek, in a poor light. In the end, Disney did end up paying Johansson an additional amount because her film was shifted to the streaming service. Disney lost both money and credibility, much of which could have been avoided by arriving at a quietly negotiated settlement weeks earlier. By this point, Chapek had received a number of mostly self-inflicted wounds over the dispute with Johansson. Most significantly, he damaged the company's ability to attract talent. Around Hollywood, A-list stars might think twice before signing another contract with Disney. This was particularly concerning for Marvel Studios, who regularly worked with highly visible actors. Second, the exchange again cast a spotlight on gender differences in pay at Disney. And lastly, the ordeal highlighted Chapek's lack of experience in negotiating with top-level talent, which was now perceived as a significant weakness in his abilities as CEO, especially as this had been one area in which his predecessor Bob Iger had excelled. The next story to break involved Disney's plans to move most of the parks, experiences, and products division from Burbank and Glendale to Lake Nona, Florida. This included Walt Disney Imagineering, which over decades had assembled a unique team and facilities that were largely arranged to create experiences for the Disney parks. This plan was part of a multi-year shift inside the company that, in essence, would create two creative corporate centers. Work related to the studio's films and TV would be centered in Burbank, as Southern California remained the center of film production, while work for the parks and other experiences would be arranged into the Lake Nona area of Central Florida, as Orlando over the previous 3 decades had become the center of America's theme park business. Due to some earlier company reshuffling in which Disney Products was bundled with parks and experiences, the products division would also move to Florida. Disney would later explain that another part of their rationale was, quote, Florida's business-friendly climate, which was code for tax benefits and fewer regulations, essentially a climate where the Disney entities would find friendly relationships with state and local government. According to the Wall Street Journal, Disney stood to receive, quote, an estimated $570 million in tax breaks over 20 years by moving these divisions to Florida. Initially in July 2021, Disney announced that they would move 2,000 professional jobs from California to that new regional campus in Lake Nona, Florida, though everyone in the Parks, Experiences, and Products division was informed that over time, the company expected that many of these jobs would eventually be relocated to the new Lake Nona campus not far from the Orlando airport, which would make it easy for executives to fly from the new campus to Burbank. The company also offered to give affected employees a moving allowance. But as it soon became clear, there were multiple problems with this plan. To illustrate how this worked, I'll largely follow the California-based employees in Imagineering. The plan to develop a creative campus in Florida was first explored in 2019, though inside the company this plan was kept quiet for about 2 years. In 2019, there were roughly 1,800 Imagineers on the California campus. The first problem was that Disney failed to recognize how few of their California-based professionals, many with deep ties to the region, would decide to walk away from their jobs rather than relocate their families to a new state. This story would unfold during the months that followed the announcement. The second concern, the timeline that led up to the announcement. 2020 and 2021 were not good years for Disney professionals, including Imagineers. The start of the pandemic brought deep furloughs in which hundreds were eventually let go due to canceled projects, including many once earmarked for Epcot. In September of that same year, Disney announced that it would lay off another 411 Imagineers. This brought the number of Glendale-based Imagineers down to well under 1,000. In the months that followed, some well-known and well-paid Disney designers began to sense the way the wind was blowing and decided to either change jobs or accept retirement offers. These included Joe Rohde, who was the lead creative for Animal Kingdom and Alani, and in more recent years had overseen efforts to integrate Marvel properties into the parks. His departure was announced as a retirement, though 1 month after turning in his ears, he took a new position at Virgin Galactic. Other senior Imagineers followed him out the door, and with them, Walt Disney Imagineering lost the keepers of institutional knowledge. By this point, the Imagineering division was not only losing designers and engineers, it was losing the people who understood how to master plan and develop massive projects. Another problem concerned how Disney told employees about this move. Even though corporate executives had explored this possibility for 2 years, the co-presidents overseeing Imagineering reportedly only learned about the proposed move a couple of days before the company made the general announcement. People around them reported that they appeared distraught. The initial plan was that some members of Imagineering would move to Florida while others remained in California. But as Imagineers announced that they would rather leave the company, the plan eventually became to relocate all remaining Imagineers to Florida. Imagineers were given 3 months to commit to the move or separate from the company. Some agreed to move, but some only agreed to move in the hope that the Lake Nona project would be delayed, perhaps by years, or possibly never materialize at all. Others simply packed up their offices and found work with other companies in California focused on theme park development. By the end of 2021, it was clear that the effect of the move and how it was handled, whether intended or not, would be to largely dismantle segments of Imagineering, removing people with highly specialized skills, and downsizing the whole unit. It was in ways a mass layoff without the expense of a layoff. In response, retired Imagineers and ex-Imagineers circulated an existing petition on Change.org that asked the Disney board to fire Bob Chapek. Among the lead concerns situated in the petition was Chapek's effect on Imagineering and the parks. Quote, "He has consistently made decisions that decrease the quality of what is put into the parks, and also ones that favor using intellectual properties instead of original attractions." Retired Imagineers passed around this petition, adding their names and influence to it, as they were upset that Imagineering was in part being dismantled and moved to Florida as a shell of its former self. Though Disney hasn't released the current number of Imagineers who have agreed to move to Florida, it's no more than a few hundred, some of whom have no intention of moving but accepted the offer in the hope of remaining in California if the Lake Nona project was canceled. Another problem stemming from decisions made by corporate executives concerns employees at Pixar. With Kareem Daniel now overseeing distribution, individual studios under the Disney umbrella no longer controlled how their work was screened. This has particularly angered those at Pixar who have seen all of their films end up on Disney Plus for years. In 2020, Onward, which was released 2 weeks before theaters shut down, was quickly reslotted over to Disney Plus. I should point out that this shift with Onward happened before Daniel was hired. Later that year, after Daniel joined the company, Soul premiered on Disney Plus. In 2021, Luca premiered on Disney Plus, and this past month, Turning Red premiered on Disney Plus. Though the release strategies of Onward and Soul were more likely casualties of the pandemic, the release strategies of Luca and Turning Red were arranged more to drive new subscriptions and to retain existing subscribers over on Disney Plus. The decision to shift Turning Red's release to Disney Plus was particularly difficult for the artists at Pixar to accept. After Luca, the company had promised that no more Pixar films would be released directly to streaming. Following this, in November, the company released Encanto, produced by Pixar's sister company Disney Animation, to theaters. More so than many live-action films, Pixar productions, with their high level of detail, were arranged for a big screen experience, as much of the visual texturing in their films would be lost on the small screen. On the day that the announcement was made that Turning Red would premiere on Disney+, one person at Pixar, asking to remain anonymous, told Insider, quote, "It's safe to say that we're all feeling extremely disappointed. Until today, we all thought Turning Red would be our return to the big screen, and everyone at the studio was excited about it being this film in particular. It was quite a blow." Another area where Chapek has alienated people is in Disney's customer base. In this, it's not so much fans of the films. From what I've seen, there's very little resentment between fans of movies towards Chapek. Moviegoers generally have been satisfied with recent Disney efforts on the big screen, such as Encanto, and on the small screen, such as The Mandalorian. Specifically, it's fans of the park, such as those with annual passes, fans who see themselves as multi-year or even lifelong dedicated supporters of Disney, who are upset with Chapek. Chapek has been straightforward about prioritizing the needs of traditional tourists above the needs of deep fans. He has expressed this through statements and actions. Last August, he offered this statement in an earnings call. Quote, "Typically, someone who travels and stays for 5 to 7 days is marginally more valuable to the business than someone who comes in on an annual pass and stays a day or two and consumes less merchandise and food and beverage." New pricing strategies, such as Genie Plus, clearly prioritize traditional tourists over pass holders. Genie Plus is a reasonable value for a tourist spending an entire day at a park, but a poor value for a typical pass holder who drops by the parks for an evening to get dinner and maybe catch a ride or two. The new reservation system as well also prioritizes traditional tourists with day tickets over fans with annual passes. The results of these decisions produced that petition on change.org that I mentioned earlier, calling for the removal of Chapek from his role as CEO. Last I checked, the petition had over 110,000 signatures. But none of these are the central problem that has pushed Chapek's role as CEO into actual jeopardy. The largest and most significant public problem came from his handling of what is commonly known as the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida this past month. Chapek's most recent troubles are focused on Florida House Bill 1557, the Parental Rights in Education bill, more commonly known as the Don't Say Gay bill. Disney is not an overtly political company, but unlike Universal or Warner Brothers, Disney is a company that is identified with a core set of values. Many of its family films, particularly the animated features, engage in moral lessons. And for the past 2 decades, with films such as Coco, Moana, Brave, Encanto, and The Princess and the Frog, the company has actively embraced the concept of inclusion as a central piece of its brand identity. During many of those same years, Disney cast members and fans became accustomed to the way that Bob Iger managed his political views. Whether you agreed or disagreed with him, he was upfront and very public about his beliefs, often talking to the press about his politics, which were progressive and often focused on inclusivity. Iger himself was a registered Democrat. He opposed immigration bans and walked away from a committee organized by President Trump. His political stance was part of his public persona. Quote, "The filter that I used," Iger said, "to determine whether we, meaning the Disney company, should or should not weigh in on a political issue considered a few factors. What would its impact have on our employees, on our shareholders, and our customers? And if any of those three constituencies had a deep interest in or would be affected by whatever was the matter at hand, then it was something I thought we should consider weighing in on. Iger often saw political issues as human-centered, typically with moral overtones. He tended to lean left in his outlook, and as such, his approach to many issues was fairly predictable. More practically, under Iger, Disney employees believed that if a political issue was important to a large number of them, it would likely be taken up in some way by the company. The company sponsored its own PAC, which gave generously to various causes, those supported by both Democrats and Republicans. Though Iger's politics may have been straightforward, politics inside the Walt Disney Company as a whole, however, were a little more complex. Not surprisingly, divisions in California tended to be left-leaning. In 2019, Iger said that it would be, quote, very difficult for Disney, meaning Marvel Studios, a division housed in California, to continue to film in Georgia if the state passed the heartbeat bill banning nearly all abortions. In this, Iger explained that he saw his role as CEO as one where he acted on what he felt was the moral center point of the company, or at least certain divisions inside the company. Quote, I think many people who work for us, Iger said about the Georgia bill, will not want to work there, and we will have to heed their wishes in that regard. Conversely, divisions in Florida tend to be a little more right-leaning, to the point where, over many years, Republicans regularly held fundraising events and conferences in convention space owned by Disney World. Disney is a large corporation. It has 5 divisions, such as studio content, and each of those 5 divisions has many individual companies or entities, such as Lucasfilm. The center point of political thought can shift from entity to entity, with each having their own cultural identity. Pixar's culture, which is focused on democratic ideals, is different than that of Walt Disney World, where Disney dollars have supported many Republican candidates over the last 2 decades, as Republicans tend to control power there. If I had to categorize the company overall, I'd say that the company leans conservative on fiscal issues and they lean liberal on social concerns. Though Iger's political beliefs are fairly public, for example, he made large donations to Democratic concerns, Bob Chapek's political outlook is more difficult to define. Chapek is a person who is so private that at the time he was appointed CEO, no members of the press knew exactly how old he was. They were able to find the year he graduated from high school and then arrive at an approximate age from there. If you follow Chapek's political contributions, you'll find that he's supported both Democrats and Republicans. But most of his political donations in recent years were made to the Disney PAC, which gives money to both parties. Chapek's giving strategy defines the actions of a person interested in participating, but not in choosing a side. On March 2, 2020, The Hollywood Reporter ran a story about Chapek using a source close to him. Quote, Chapek is staunchly opposed to bringing Disney into issues he deems irrelevant to the company and its businesses. This source explained. Disney's chief of corporate affairs, Jeff Morrell, more or less corroborated this. Quote, whatever Bob's personal politics are, he's not an activist and he doesn't bring any partisan agenda to work. In other words, as Chapek began to run Disney as the solo CEO, after Iger retired as executive chairman, Chapek wanted to move the company away from political positions, specifically those focused on culture wars. Or maybe, to put this more succinctly, he wanted Disney to avoid political issues on which there was not already wide support. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Disney was the first major studio to pull its films from Russia in protest of this military action. But in terms of an anti-Russia front, on this there was already bipartisan support. Chapek may have seen a strategy of non-commitment as a practical decision, especially in a country with increasingly polarizing political opinions. In this environment, Disney as a company had unique challenges. One of its largest divisions, Disney World, was in a right-leaning state largely controlled by Republicans, though the most profitable group of visitors to the Florida resort came from some of the most left-leaning regions of the country, specifically the Northeast and the greater Chicago area. Moreover, many of the company's key divisions, such as Lucasfilm, Pixar, and Marvel, were not only located in California, they were located in some of the most Democratic-centered regions of the state, namely the Bay Area and Los Angeles. Chapek's plan initially was to distance the company from cultural politics, but this, too, was a plan that ultimately brought him significant harm. After Iger's 15 years as CEO, what Disney employees were not used to was a CEO who did not express themselves on significant issues. Chapek's initial plan, presumably, was to distance himself and the company entirely from politics. There were merits to this plan as it would allow the company to exist in a space where people from all political backgrounds were welcomed. But this plan started to fall apart in damaging ways in February. On February 25th, Scott Maxwell, a reporter at the Orlando Sentinel, wrote a story that tied Disney donations to House Bill 1557, the Parental Rights in Education Bill, more commonly known in the press as the Don't Say Gay Bill. This bill, if passed, would prohibit public elementary school teachers from K through third grade from discussing sexual orientation and gender identity. It could also prohibit teachers of older grades from discussing those same issues when, quote, not age-appropriate or developmentally appropriate, without defining what those terms meant. If parents felt that their child had experienced classroom conversations outside of these ranges, they could sue the school district for damages. Quote, the parks preach inclusion in their marketing campaigns, Maxwell said in his article, but Disney has given money to every single sponsor and co-sponsor of this year's infamous Don't Say Gay Bill. Disney knows who these people are. The Senate sponsor, Ocala Republican Dennis Baxley, has backed anti-gay legislation for years, including laws to prevent gay couples from adopting kids who otherwise wouldn't have a family at all. Baxley once compared kids who live with same-sex parents to kids raised by alcoholics and abusers. Maxwell went on to discuss what he believed was a deep hypocrisy. On the one hand, Disney supported politicians who proposed the Don't Say Gay Bill, and on the other hand, quote, the park puts out the Rainbow Mickeys during gay days to profit off an audience attracted by concepts of inclusion. He also, in fairness, pointed out that Disney was not the only corporation who financially backed these politicians. Others included Anheuser-Busch, parent company to SeaWorld and Busch Gardens, Comcast, parent company to Universal Studios, as well as Duke Energy, Publix, and others. This story, first published in the Sentinel, was then picked up by other papers and reported on TV news shows across the country. On Monday, February 28th, leaders of Disney's LGBTQIA+ groups sent a letter to Chapek and Company executives asking that they, as one of the largest employers in Florida, quote, issue a public statement condemning anti-LGBTQIA+ policies in the U.S. The letter continued to say, quote, we urge you to begin with speaking against these acts, the Don't Say Gay Bill in Florida, set to go into effect July 1st, and the Texas governor's directive for state agencies to investigate gender-affirming care as child abuse. The company did not make a statement. Instead, the company asked one of its lobbyists, Letitia Adams, to meet with a few state congresspeople to soften the wording of the Florida bill, essentially changing the language so that the bill would prohibit early elementary school teachers from talking about all sexual activity and human sexuality rather than sexual orientation and gender identity, as that specifically targeted LGBTQ concerns and separated those concerns from more universal issues of sexuality. Essentially, Adams suggested to members of the Florida House of Representatives that if the concern was that the discussion of sexuality needed to be regulated, then shouldn't this apply to all such classroom discussions? These proposals went nowhere, with the bill retaining language about sexual orientation and gender identity, which specifically singled out LGBTQ concerns. Some involved in Florida politics pointed out that Disney's influence to change the bill arrived very late in the bill's development, a few days before it went up for a vote. The effort, it was suggested, was a result of the controversy then playing out on news shows and in papers across the country, tying Disney's financial support to the co-sponsors of the bill rather than a sincere concern about the material in the bill itself. At this point, reaction to Disney's involvement was picked up by a few key spokespeople for the LGBTQ community. New York Times bestselling author Eric Cervini called for a boycott of Disney products, including the parks and Disney+. On Friday, March 4th, the company released a statement explaining that executives understood how important this issue was to LGBTQ employees. Then they explained, quote, "The biggest impact we can have in creating a more inclusive world is through the inspiring content we produce, the welcoming culture we create here, and the diverse community organizations we support, including those representing the LGBTQ+ community." Those inside the company quickly pointed out that this was not a statement about the Florida bill. Also on March 4th, Chapek met with LGBTQ leaders at Disney to discuss their concerns. The following Monday, he wrote a memo to employees to explain his takeaways from the meeting. Quote, "One common theme was a disappointment that the company has not issued a public statement condemning the legislation. That disappointment was compounded by the fact that, while not perfect, our company has a long history of supporting the LGBTQ+ community, and in fact has played an important role in the personal journeys of so many of our employees. I want to be crystal clear. I and the entire leadership team unequivocally stand in support of our LGBTQ+ employees, their families, and their communities." The letter ended by saying, quote, "Our company has been a force for inclusion for a long time, and that will not change on my watch." During that same period, as Bob Chapek was digesting his conversation with the LGBTQ leaders, Dana Terrace, the creator of Disney's Owl House, took to Twitter to express her frustrations. Owl House was the first Disney animated production to feature the evolution of a same-gender romance as a central part of its overall plot, as experienced by two young women, presumably around 14 years old. The show also featured a non-binary character. Quote, "How fun that this place keeps finding new ways to tear my heart apart," Terrace wrote. "I sure feel inspired." She then suggested that fans of Owl House buy fan-made merchandise of Owl House characters on Etsy, presumably so the profits wouldn't go to Disney. 2 days later, on March 9th, employees at Pixar responded to Disney executives explaining that Chapek's recent statements didn't match their experience, particularly the part about creating content that represented the LGBTQ+ community. The announcement from Chapek, they said, quote, "rang hollow. It began with the claim that Disney has a long history of supporting the LGBT community, but Disney parks did not officially host Pride until 2019, in Paris alone." In recent years, according to the letter, Disney had censored same-sex romance in Pixar features. Quote, "We at Pixar," the letter continued, "have personally witnessed beautiful stories full of diverse characters come back from Disney corporate reviews, shaved down to crumbs of what they once were. Nearly every moment of overtly gay affection is cut at Disney's behest, regardless of when there is protest from both the creative teams and the executive leadership at Pixar." According to Variety, quote, "Creatives within the studio have tried for years to incorporate LGBTQ identity into its storytelling in ways big and small. only to have those efforts consistently thwarted. The letter was, however, influential in changing the direction of a current Pixar film. Up until 2022, same-gender relationships included in Pixar features have been relegated to minor or background characters, in part so these features wouldn't be banned in China and a handful of other world markets where movies must be approved by a national board of review. The upcoming Pixar feature, Lightyear, set to be released this summer, once featured a kiss between two female characters in a long-term relationship. That moment had been cut from the film. But after fallout over the recent controversies, that scene was placed back into the movie, a decision that will likely see the film banned in a few markets. On that same day, March 9th, Bob Chapek called Governor DeSantis to discuss the Florida bill. And later that day, he finally denounced the bill at the yearly shareholders meeting. He tried to frame Disney's political donations to representatives who sponsored the bill as a general support of political activities rather than as support of specific issues. Quote, "When we donate money to different political candidates," Chapek said, "we have no idea how they're going to vote going forward into the future." Chapek then focused his comments on the bill itself. Quote, "We were opposed to the bill from the onset, but we chose not to take a public position on it," Chapek continued. He then explained that the company tried to work quietly with both Democrats and Republicans to these ends, but were unsuccessful. He also explained that he had contacted DeSantis. Quote, "The governor heard our concerns and agreed to meet with me and the LGBTQ+ members of our senior team in Florida to discuss ways to address them." Chapek also announced that Disney would donate to LGBTQ causes, including the Human Rights Campaign. Following this statement, others pointed out that Chapek likely overstated the company's involvement, explaining that Disney had sent just one lobbyist late in the game to soften the language rather than to oppose the bill. A representative from the governor's office, Christina Pushaw, also took the opportunity to highlight the governor's position at Chapek's expense, largely to demonstrate that, again, that DeSantis was not swayed by large corporations. Quote, "Disney contacted our office today to speak with the governor," she said. "This is the first time we've heard from Disney regarding HB 1557. The governor did take the call from Mr. Chapek. The governor's position has not changed. No in-person meeting has been scheduled yet." Lastly, the interim president of the Human Rights Campaign, Joni Madison, posted a notice that the HRC would reject the proposed donation from Disney. Quote, "The Human Rights Campaign will not accept this money from Disney," Madison said, "until we see them build on their public commitment and work with LGBTQ+ advocates to ensure that dangerous proposals like Florida's Don't Say Gay or trans bill don't become dangerous laws, and if they do, to work to get them off the books." For many employees inside Disney, these elements together, particularly the statement from the governor's office, confirmed that Chapek's effort to oppose the bill had been at most minimal. Tuesday, March 9th, was not a good day for Bob Chapek. On Wednesday and Thursday, employees held meetings in person and over Zoom to express their frustration with Chapek's comments. One Zoom meeting open to Disney employees from multiple divisions drew 800 participants, which in some circles of the company felt like a type of organized mutiny. On Friday, March 11th, Chapek tried to turn the tide that had been moving against him by issuing a formal apology as a company-wide memo. Quote, "Thank you to all who have reached out to me, sharing your pain, frustration, and sadness over the company's response to the Florida Don't Say Gay bill," Chapek wrote. "Speaking to you, reading your messages, and meeting with you have helped me better understand how painful our silence was. It is clear that this is not just an issue about a bill in Florida, but instead yet another challenge to basic human rights. You needed me to be a stronger ally in the fight for equal rights, and I let you down. I am sorry. He said that the company would pause political contributions in Florida to ensure that future contributions, quote, better reflect our values. In 2020, the company had donated $4.8 million to Florida candidates, with money going to both Democrats and Republicans. But in that $4.8 million was $913,000 that went to the Republican Party of Florida and $586,000 that went to individual Republican Senate campaigns. Disney also donated $50,000 directly to DeSantis, the person who was shaping up to be Chapek's main opponent in Florida. The question at this point was simple. Would Chapek's statement be enough to sway opinion inside and outside the company? The answer perhaps arrived on Sunday, as comedian John Oliver discussed Chapek's comments on his HBO show Last Week Tonight. He took aim specifically at Chapek's comment about how Disney had no idea how candidates the company supported would likely vote in the future. Quote, "It is actively insulting," Oliver chided, "because it's just not how donating works. When you donate money, you generally know what the recipient is going to do with it. That is why people donate to Feeding America and not to Feeding America or maybe taking food away from America." Oliver went on to say, marginalized creators have made billions of dollars for Disney. Should it embarrass them that it took them until this week to realize that they shouldn't take that money and use it to actively undermine those creators' interests? In the days that followed, entities inside the Disney company began to message their fans directly that their group opposed Disney's corporate silence on the Florida bill. On March 15th, Marvel posted on their Twitter account, quote, "We strongly denounce any and all legislation that infringes on the basic human rights of the LGBTQIA+ community. Marvel Studios stands for hope, inclusivity, and strength." Lucasfilm posted a graphic on Instagram conveying a similar message. The image was the Rebel Alliance symbol, a starbird that, for this post, was arranged with the rainbow colors of the Progress flag. The message next to the image was similar to that of the Marvel post. Quote, "Lucasfilm stands with the LGBTQIA+ community, within our studios, within our fandom, and across the entire world." Disney employees then arranged a website called whereischapek.com to organize regular walkouts. Quote, "Starting the week of March 14th, the website announced, we will begin a series of collective actions together to make our voices and demands heard." From March 15th through the 21st, the site organized 15-minute walkouts, arranged around the break period between 3 and 3:15. Then on Tuesday, March 22nd, the site arranged a full-day walkout. Also on the site were a series of Zoom backgrounds that employees could use to visually amplify their message. On March 22nd, employees at various Disney entities walked out of their offices to protest how executives had handled this situation. Organizers of the walkout specifically pointed to the company's, quote, "lack of action." In Burbank, hundreds of employees walked on the public sidewalk just outside the gates. Many of them chanted, quote, "Say gay," to oppose the Florida bill. Along with the walkouts, at least one TV show, Disney Channel's Bunked, now in its 5th season, ceased activities for the day in support of the walkout. On this same day, the Disney Parks Experiences and Products division posted an image on its Disney Parks Instagram account, the easily identifiable circular outline of Mickey Mouse, filled in with the colored bands of the Progress flag. The text began with the words of Walt, quote, "To all who come to this happy place, welcome," with the word all arranged in caps for emphasis. Similar messages of support were posted by various Disney entities, ESPN, FX Networks, Disney Plus, and Hulu. In response, Governor DeSantis insisted that he would sign the bill and wouldn't be manipulated by what he called woke corporations, even if one of those corporations was one of the largest employers in his state. He also suggested that instead of meddling in Florida politics, Disney executives should instead look at their partnership with China, a country with known human rights concerns. One day after the bill was signed into law, Disney released a press statement saying, quote, "Our goal as a company is for this law to be repealed by the legislature or struck down in the courts." It closed with, quote, "We are dedicated to standing up for the rights and safety of LGBTQ plus members of the Disney family, as well as the LGBTQ plus community in Florida and across the country." This new battle between Disney and the state of Florida gave DeSantis, who is likely considering a bid for the presidency in 2024, a national public platform to demonstrate his ability to stand up to large companies, even if those activities financially hurt his state. With continued pressure from Disney, DeSantis said, quote, "This state is governed by the interest of the state of Florida. It is not based on the demands of California corporate executives. They do not run this state. They do not control this state. If this was such an affront, why weren't they speaking up at the outset?" And this DeSantis was again suggesting that Disney was more concerned with protecting its brand image than with opposing the bill when it was first introduced weeks ago. Imagineers, still in California, saw the escalating conflict as an opportunity to more forcefully voice their objections to the Lake Nona campus. Some of them asked why, in light of these hostilities, would Disney move another 2,000 workers to a state with whom it was in an open and ongoing dispute. Other Imagineers said they now might not be willing to transfer to a state whose cultural climate was so different than their longtime home state of California. At this point, in the final week of March, members of the Florida State Congress began to explore ways that the state government could use political pressure against Disney interests to manage the company's dissent, though news of these meetings would not emerge for a few days. On March 29th, after DeSantis had received national press coverage of this dispute, a spokesperson for his office said that with the rising tensions between Disney and the state, a face-to-face meeting was increasingly unlikely. In terms of news coverage to his base, DeSantis appeared a winner, a lone politician standing up to a large corporation, while in the press, Chapek repeatedly looked less than fully prepared for the political realities of being a CEO of a large corporation in 2022. The following day, on March 30th, Congressman Roach, one of the co-sponsors of the Don't Say Gay bill, explained that he and fellow Republicans were examining if it was possible to revoke the Reedy Creek Improvement Act. This was an act arranged in 1967 that allowed Disney to self-regulate on their property, granting them significant latitude in how they created unique hotels and attractions. Quote, "Yesterday was the second meeting in a week," Roach posted on Twitter, "with fellow legislators to discuss a repeal of the 1967 Reedy Creek Improvement Act, which allows Disney to act as its own government. If Disney wants to embrace woke ideology, it seems fitting that they should be regulated by Orange County." It's unlikely that the state government would repeal the Reedy Creek Act, but simply that Congress people had held multiple meetings to explore this possibility to find a new level of antagonism that now existed between the state and Disney. That same day, The Hollywood Reporter printed an article that gave voice to what many industry insiders had been discussing all week: the likelihood of Chapek being released when his current 3-year contract ends next February. The following day, March 31st, Republicans continued to put pressure on Disney. At an event in West Palm Beach, Governor DeSantis echoed Roach's statements of the previous day. Quote, "As a matter of first principle, I don't support special privileges in law just because a company is powerful and they've been able to wield a lot of power." He pointed to special exemptions, carve-outs, and tax breaks that Disney had received in recent years, including the $570 million tax break for developing a campus at Lake Nona. He indicated that continued special treatment for Disney was not good for the state. Quote, "I just don't think you have very many people in the legislature anymore who are going to be able to defend a lot of what has been done over many, many years to really have Disney almost govern themselves in some of these things," he added. "You know, that was probably never appropriate to start, but it's certainly not appropriate now." The following day, on April 1st, as the story about the possibility of repealing Disney's Reedy Creek Act was reprinted in newspapers across the state, Governor DeSantis told reporters in Titusville that he was receptive to the idea of repealing or amending the 1967 Act. Quote, "As the governor, I could be presented with changes to that," he said, "and I think I've said I'd be receptive to that. But ultimately, the legislature would have to move forward. So I know that there's a lot of discussion about that, but we'll just have to see how that shakes out." In the end, Chapek's response to House Bill 1557 proved divisive for many groups. Ideally, back in February, he could have framed both a personal and corporate response to the bill in such a way it did not lead to a public battle with the state government of Florida. As a result, thousands of employees staged multi-day walkouts. Liberals felt that Chapek had waited too long before supporting LGBTQ concerns and had failed them. Conservatives wanted Chapek to stay out of politics altogether, which also didn't happen. And Imagineers used this moment to insist that Chapek cancel company plans to build a new creative campus in Lake Nona, Florida. One industry executive quoted in that Hollywood Reporter article suggested that the problem stemmed from Chapek's inability to read groups as emotional entities. That is, Chapek, in his opinion, had strengths in the business end of Disney, but less so in the people end. Quote, "There's a lack of awareness," he said, "of what makes a company in terms of people and the culture." These types of storms can be weathered by CEOs, as top-level executives are largely accountable to shareholder value and the board. But there's one more element here that places Chapek's role at the company in jeopardy. Disney's share price has lost about a third of its value in the past year, even as parks and cruise ships continue to reopen. This primarily is what shareholders respond to. The combination of these areas, from dissent inside the company to criticism from the fan community to political battles in Florida to the lowered share price, put Chapek's career at a crossroads. People can change. There's the possibility that this becomes a moment Chapek is able to deeply reimagine his role as CEO. And though I realize much of this episode has been focused on current problems within the company, I want to harken back to some successes arranged by Chapek that have played out in the company's favor, such as higher health safety standards at the theme parks during the pandemic and being the first studio to remove its releases from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. But generally, what most observers are pointing out is that Disney cannot successfully continue with these current levels of problems, especially as they play out in public and government space. We are at a point where, in the coming months, something significant must change. Either a profound leadership change in Chapek himself, along with the company working in a new direction, or perhaps a pivot in leadership personnel next February. I suspect the board of directors already knows this. At this point, I think the real question is, what will change in the months ahead? If you're interested in knowing more about Bob Chapek, 2 years ago, just after he was named CEO, we posted a brief biography about him. It's included in the episode titled Disney and the Coronavirus #5. I'll be back next week with a new episode continuing our multi-part series on the lives of the Sherman brothers, Dick and Bob, who defined the music of Disney films in Disneyland during the final decade of Walt's life. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, you can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.